Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I am Joy Harris, and I'm here to talk to you about Hannah Arendt's On Revolution and to situate it alongside her other major works. I know that you guys have already read Eichmann in Jerusalem, so you have a good grounding on Arendt's thought, but we're going to go into it a little bit further. So I like to start any conversation on Arendt with some biographical notes, because I believe that her life experience significantly informed her intellectual life. Arendt was born in 1906 in Germany to a non-practicing Jewish family. She attended the University of Marburg, where she studied with Martin Heidegger while he was writing Being in Time, for those of you who like Heidegger. While she was at Marburg, Arendt had an affair with Heidegger, which everyone likes to talk about. Everyone wants to just talk about her 9-month or whatever long affair with Heidegger. Heidegger was not that important to Hannah Arendt. She moved along after him. So after Arendt was studying with Heidegger, she spent a semester at the University of Freiburg, where she listened to lectures by Edmund Husserl, who's the father of contemporary phenomenology. And then she completed her dissertation under Karl Jaspers, another really famous German philosopher, and he was working on one of his big texts on existence. So it's important to note that despite participating in one of the most honestly exciting and important times in philosophy, Arendt ultimately turned her back from it, stating firmly in her later years that she was a political theorist, not a philosopher. So why would Arendt feel this way? She's got Heidegger and Husserl and Jaspers. Why would she do this? And the short answer is that she doubted the practicality of philosophy as pure theory. After graduating, Arendt worked for a newspaper, and she became more involved in politics. After the burning of the Reichstag in 1933, Arendt stayed in Berlin and acted as an activist, ultimately getting involved with the Zionists. During this time, she used her apartment as an underground railroad for fugitives, which is awesome. And she was arrested by the Gestapo for distributing anti-state propaganda. She then went to Paris, and prior to the German invasion of France, she was remanded to an internment camp, but she ultimately escaped, and she went to New York City in 1941. So it's important to remember in this little moment that Arendt has, again, studied with these great philosophers. Her command of the German language is wonderful and beautiful. That is her area, right, is to have beautiful language. She goes to the United States, and she doesn't know any English. No English. So when you're reading the text, right, sometimes her sentences just don't make sense, and they're kind of like, whoa, they're going everywhere. Part of that is because she's a German thinker writing in English. Yes?
How long was she locked up in an internment camp?
Not only for a few months, not for very
few
long.
months.
Yeah, not for very long. And there was no, very early. So
Just for being an activist?
Yeah, basically. So she gets to New York City. She has to learn English, which is crazy. And then she started writing and publishing political articles. And she became the executive director of the Commission on European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. She then became an editor at Schocken Books and participated in the campaign for a two-state solution for Palestine. So Arendt published her seminal text between 1951 and 1963, and that includes Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and On Revolution. Ultimately, Arendt lectured at universities across the US. She became the first woman appointed as a full-time professor at Princeton in 1959. And toward the end of her career, she was teaching political theory at the New School for Social Research in New York. In order to understand On Revolution, it's important to see how it fits into Arendt's texts at the time. So Revolution was definitely influenced by Origins, The Human Condition, and by Eichmann. So we're going to kind of just go through. These are really, really big texts. But I feel like it's important for you to get a feel for some of the main ideas in these texts, because they all work together in On Revolution. Oh, I'm the wrong way. There we go. So Origins of Totalitarianism was published in 1951, and it was one of the first systematic analyses of what Arendt would call the final solution. Origins, is a huge text. And I have to tell the story that when I was in senior political theory, Dr. Hoy's senior political theory class, and he gives that like 5-page list of books to choose from on like what you want to write your book report on. I looked through the list for a woman, right? Because there's not a lot of women writers in political theory. And I was like, this looks good. Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. That sounds awesome. And then I got the book, and it's like freaking huge. It's really, really, really long, but I already committed to it. And I was like, I can do it. So, Origins is a huge text, and it's divided into 3 sections. So, section 1 is the history of anti-Semitism. Section 2 is the rise of imperialism, and section 3 is her meditation on totalitarianism. So again, lots to talk about in Origins, but I'm gonna point out 2 things. First, Arendt was concerned with asking how Hitler came to power, not necessarily why. So I say this, how, not why. In the section on anti-Semitism, she gives a very lengthy and detailed articulation of the history, political, economic, and social context around anti-Semitism. She wanted to evaluate the exact steps that were taken that led to the mass destruction of the Jews. Unlike other writers who were concerned with its sort of psychological underpinnings, like what was Hitler's childhood like that made him, all those sorts of things, Arendt wasn't necessarily interested in this. She wasn't interested in the why did this happen. She was much more practical. She wanted to know what did we need to do in the future to avoid something like this happening again. So the how, not why. Second, Arendt was concerned with an analysis that focused on the we, not I. So how, not why, we, not I. That is to say, she's concerned with how citizens as an assembled group acted in a particular way. She wasn't as interested in the story of specific people necessarily, and you see this as well in Eichmann because she's very critical of witnesses that give dramatic first-person testimony. In fact, she's wary of almost all the testimony in the Eichmann trial, which you guys probably read about. Again, in Origins, Arendt was focused on dissecting the time period that led to and included the final solution because she wanted to ensure that it would never happen again. Though catharsis is a powerful act when it's shared in public space, Arendt believed that it could thwart rational political action. And that's not to say that Arendt is not concerned with the individual. And in step with her philosophical background, Arendt, like Husserl, placed the origin of knowledge in the individual, Husserl through consciousness and the phenomenological method, and Arendt through the act of thinking in private and acting in public via a dialectic form of contemplation. That's a lot to say all at once. So we can talk about that later if we want to. But she was concerned with sort of making, excuse me, she was concerned about this dialectic of thinking in her unfinished text, The Life of the Mind. So the individual and her capacity to change the world through even one simple word, so again, looking at the we, not I, the individual and her capacity to change the world through even one simple word is a focus in The Human Condition, which we'll talk about in a second, and it's discussed in the context of political action and storytelling in The Human Condition. And she is interested in the role that theater plays in public moral education, that these concepts are problematic and we just can't get into that. So to summarize Origins, Arendt was interested in how, not why, and we, not I. The application of this idea in the writing, the application of this idea in the writing of Eichmann turned out to be very controversial and caused her to be blacklisted from a lot of intellectual circles. Okay, wow, that's really brief on Origins of Totalitarianism. But we're gonna move along, and we're gonna talk about the human condition. So this was published in 1958, and it lays out the categories and concepts that would be pervasive through the rest of Arendt's work. So 3 of the major themes in the human condition are the private, public, social triad, the labor, work, action triad, and her definition of political action as the combination of words and deeds in public space. And that's the grounding for the conference that's coming up in April. Arendt divides up our world into the private, which is basically our home, and the public, which is our shared world where we all interact with one another. Arendt thinks that this is the most appropriate way of dividing up our life because she so very much values intimacy. In The Human Condition, she says that love in particular cannot withstand the bright light of the public. And this makes sense. I'm sure that each of you have a friend or a partner and you have shared secrets and stories about your life and the way you view the world you share with them. And these things that are special in your relationship, if they're brought outside of the relationship, can seem like sort of exaggerated and weird. So you have like a pet name for someone and you call them that and it like really sounds weird, and you use it like with people who don't know you. And I struggle a lot with Arendt's reverence for intimacy, because as a scholar, I like the idea of her reading her letters with Heidegger, right? And reading her letters with Karl Jaspers, and you're thinking all these things are happening, and I'm going to gain a special insight into what was happening. But like, did she really want us to read those letters? Did she really? I don't know. But and I even got to read some of the letters like in Bard Archive, right? You like go in with your little gloves. You're like, oh, Arendt wrote this little letter, and it's about meeting up for lunch at 2:00 on Tuesday. It makes me really dorky. But again, like I wonder if she would really want us to read those letters. But between this idea of the private, like our home, and the public, which is our shared world, there's the social. And the social sphere arises when we share our private life in public. Arendt worries that it is the social that will ultimately destroy the safety of the private and the efficacy of the public. In short, Arendt felt that there are just some things that are not meant for everyone to know, and those include the love we feel for others, as I mentioned, and the care for our bodies. And that leads us to the labor, work, action triad. For Arendt, labor is the word she uses to describe the functioning and maintenance of our bodies. This can include our healthiness, our sickness, and even childbearing. Anything body-related is in the category of labor. Work is the word she uses to describe creation. We work when we create objects and infrastructure, particularly objects that outlive us. Action is when we have the courage to go into public space and use words and deeds to reveal who we truly are amongst our peers. It's this very grand idea of action. So Eichmann, published in 1963, could be its own talk altogether, and you guys have already studied it. But briefly, Arendt controversially asserts that everyone, including the Jews, were somehow implicated and or involved in the final solution. You guys talked about that, right? And that Eichmann wasn't an evil person. He was simply a person who acted without thinking. He failed to think. And I want to make a little aside here about the importance of Arendt's insistence on the combination of thinking and acting together, because she knew from experience that the two had to go hand in hand. So if Eichmann acted without thinking, then it is her former mentor Martin Heidegger, who thought without acting. While he was the rector at Freiburg, Heidegger, who was a Nazi sympathizer, did not protest when the German government revoked the university appointments and even the library cards of the Jewish professors. This included Husserl, Heidegger's peer, and the person who helped him get the job as rector to begin with. And so there are various nuanced stories about this, but it is my understanding that when Heidegger became rector, the rules, the laws from the German government were already in place, right? And so he didn't really approve or protest the laws. He just kind of sat there and was like, these are already in place. I don't have to do anything with it, which is exactly what Arendt is talking about, right? Which is this thinking and not acting, and I call acting and not thinking. So it was shocking, and I believe that this influenced Arendt a lot, not only because it was, she basically threw the guy who got her a job, like, literally under the bus. But because Heidegger was like he's this icon in German philosophy, right? Like he's this brilliant philosopher, and then he demonstrated that the contemplative life by itself just couldn't protect the world. So this brings us to On Revolution. So like Origins, it's also a historical investigation, but like Human Condition, it also discusses and applies her established categories of thought, particularly the private, public, social triad, and the labor, work, and action triad. So I had Dr. Hoy distribute sections 2 and 3 of Revolution and Freedom in the very little type that it is. That's a lecture she gave, but it proves a really good summary of On Revolution, which is a much larger text. But in the next sort of remarks, I'm going to use information from both the essay and the book. So if there's some of this that you don't remember from the essay, that's probably because I pulled it from the book. So On Revolution was published in 1963. So that's the same year that Eichmann in Jerusalem was published. So Eichmann in Jerusalem was that series of 5 articles that were published sort of in a row through the New Yorker. So that's being published, and she spent years like going through all the testimony and the transcripts for that. And so On Revolution was published at the same time as Eichmann, and Human Condition just came out in 1958. So this is like a lot of thinking. This is a lot of work in a short amount of time. Arendt tries to answer 2 major questions in On Revolution. What is a revolution exactly, and what makes a revolution successful? And she talks about revolution as a 2-step process: the guarantee of liberty and the maintenance of public space as a form for freedom. And she works through this with an investigation of the American and French revolutions. And I am not a scholar on American history or French history, so please don't ask me anything specific about that. I will pivot to Dr. Way for that. All right. So in order to answer the question, what is revolution, Arendt, like any good philosopher, digs into the origin of the term revolution itself. She tells us that the term revolution, which stems from Latin to roll back, necessarily has celestial implications. In the first place, revolution can be seen as the tendency for an object to return to its rightful and original place, like the Earth's revolution around the sun. While in its original form, revolution as this type of movement implied political restoration, like a return of the monarchy. I like to make the case that the revolutionaries of America and France wanted to move back to a time prior to the monarch, that is, to the state of nature. So Rousseau was pivotal in the thinking behind the revolution, French Revolution. All right. In addition to restoration, and what Arendt is probably most interested in is the idea of irresistibility, which is kind of a strange word. I don't know if that's a German word that's translated into English in a strange way, but at any rate, irresistibility is just the fact that you can't stop what's going to happen. You can't stop nature, and irresistibility will be used later by philosophers as the idea of historical necessity, which Comte will talk about, and Hegel will talk about with the unfolding of spirit, and then Marx will talk about with the inevitable overtake of the bourgeois by the proletarian class. So, but again, that's just to give you some context of what happens with this idea of irresistibility. As Arendt mentioned, Arendt believed that a revolution can only be considered successful if it ultimately guarantees liberty and safeguards public space so people can act. So that's freedom is protected as well. So a revolution must include liberty and freedom. Liberty for Arendt is the freedom from want. And she looks at this in 2 specific ways. First of all, liberty is the absence of poverty and exploitation. In this way, liberty is associated with Arendt's category of labor, the maintenance of our body. So what she's saying is that you can't be a true public actor if you're hungry and you have no home to live. You're like worried about just staying alive. She also says that liberty must guarantee that you're viewed as an individual person with inherent dignity and worth. And what she means by this is that everyone must have a place to show themselves and be seen as equals. So I love the section, I'm sure it's in this part too, is in the essay, where she talks about the flood of the previously invisible, impoverished people like going out into the French streets, and the revolutionaries were like, oh my God, we had no idea things were this bad. We knew they were bad, but we didn't know it was this bad because those people literally weren't even seen, because it wasn't even important for them to be seen as people. They're kind of like creatures in a way. So Arendt notes that no one really knew how wretched these people's lives were, how many people were living in the shadows, and so that is her main concern in the idea of liberty is poverty. So Arendt associates liberty with violence. People living in abject poverty have nothing to sacrifice but their bodies. They can't protest in a liberal government. They don't have that luxury because they're either working or they're unable to work. They can't boycott. They don't have any money to purchase objects that could cause a significant economic impact. All they have are their lives. And if you're barely getting by, acting in the hopes of a better life and possibly dying might seem better than living in squalor and misery and possibly dying. Arendt does say, however, that though liberty must eradicate poverty, liberty does not guarantee wealth and it does not guarantee upward mobility. Further, liberty guarantees education, but only to the degree that it provides for a knowledgeable electorate. So for Arendt, liberty is the freedom from poverty, we associate that with labor, the guarantee to be seen alongside your peers, and it's always established through violence. That is liberty. Freedom, on the other hand, is never established through violence, because the very core of freedom is to provide a safe place where people can act and demonstrate their uniqueness. Again, this coincides with Arendt's notion of political action. Arendt speaks in terms of public happiness and provides some, I think, interesting parsing of the French Revolution's idea of public happiness versus the American notion of public happiness and how those words are used in the framing. And we can talk about that too later, but we're just gonna move along. So, to summarize, if liberty is the freedom from want, then freedom is the ability to act. Arendt's freedom, however, can only happen in a place, again, where liberty has been ensured. And Arendt makes some caveats about what freedom looks like as well. She is explicit in that the type of action that freedom provides is not a shared hatred of others. That is not what it is. Simply put, our ability to demonstrate our political greatness is what freedom is about. Like our ability to differentiate ourselves and to do something that protects the world. On Revolution, Arendt contextualizes her ideas within the history of the American and French revolutions, and Arendt clearly states that it was the American, not French Revolution that was successful, and this is reasonable because we're still functioning in the same way after the American Revolution. Arendt asserts that the American Revolution was successful because Americans were fairly wealthy to begin with. Excuse me. And compared to the French. That is to say, the guarantee of liberty was not as difficult a hurdle to overcome in the US than it was in France. In Arendt's line of thinking, which requires liberty before freedom, the Americans could almost immediately start working on freedom. And we have to keep in mind that she's looking at poverty compared to the poverty that was in France. So what we may consider these people, we may consider the American revolutionaries, the people at the time, were poor, but it's not the same kind of poverty they were seeing in France. And she mentions Montesquieu, I believe, and his description. She cites Montesquieu, saying it wasn't that bad in America. Everything was fine. Let's see. Because poverty was such an issue in France, the focus of the revolution stayed within Arendt's area of liberty and became more led by compassion than a drive for freedom. Basically, the poverty issue, what led the revolutionaries to feel sorry for the French people, prohibited their ability to establish freedom. So, Arendt is really good at creating categories, but sometimes her categories are too strict and they cause dissent. And I am a victim of this too. I like to parse everything up, and I always get called out on that. Things are not so easy to, take apart, Joy. I'm like, yes, they are. Arendt doesn't. So some critics of Arendt say that liberty is not ensured by simply meeting bare requirements like lack of poverty. So how exactly do we define lack of poverty, for example? Does poverty include just looking at food, shelter, education, and healthcare? To my mind, Arendt surely meant more than sheer subsistence, but I don't necessarily know what that is. Furthermore, Arendt's idea that the body and its labor should be kept in private contradicts our current contention that the body is political, right? We talk about this in our public dialogue. Judith Butler, who else besides Judith Butler gets someone does a spray paint portrait of her? Have you guys studied Judith Butler at all in your classes? She's awesome. Okay. So Judith Butler is one of the foremost thinkers in queer studies, and she says that it's not enough for a person to be seen in public. So remember, Arendt says, these people who are flooding the streets, yay, we finally get to see them. She's like, no, that's not enough. Normative and non-normatives of people should be not only seen as people, but acknowledged by their peers as equals with the same corresponding rights and privileges. So we know just because someone is seen as trans or homosexual, that doesn't mean they get treated the same by people, right? So that is to say, a person should not be afraid in a space of freedom, should not be afraid to demonstrate in public that they are lesbian or trans. Because of this, Butler protests Arendt's idea that political action necessarily is the combination of words and deeds in public. Butler tells us in our book on assembly, which is sort of a reaction to Arendt, that the silent showing up and asserting yourself as equal is a political act in and of itself. So she's talking about specifically people, literally, if you want to use the example of trans people like getting out into a public space and saying, yes, this is who I am, this is what I look like, this is what this is about. Instead of trying to pretend that they're not, or try to like avoid public politics. And let's see. So I'd like to talk about Diane Arbus, because I feel like she provides a really good example of this. So Diane Arbus was an American photographer working in the 60s, and she's most well known for her photos of marginalized people like circus freaks and people with Down syndrome. At the time, while these marginalized groups were considered people, they were not considered people on par with other people. Arbus sought to change this attitude. In fact, much to the surprise of the art community and historians writing about her career, Arbus's photos were included in one of the first photography exhibitions at the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York City. You have to keep in mind that the Met only showed paintings until the 1960s. There's no photography because it wasn't a proper art form. Arbus was insistent that her subjects, what we would now call queer people, should be seen in all of their human frailty and should be accepted as equals. Arbus's success in showing photos of these people, like this one of a trans person, was an early example of the body in all of its variations being seen and valued in public, not just hidden away in private. So people, I don't even know how to express, like people freaked out about Diane Arbus, right? So there's a series that she does late in her career where she goes to a home where people with Down syndrome live, because these people, their families said, oh, they have Down syndrome, we're gonna send them to a home where other people with Down syndrome live, and they can be with their peers, and they can be taken care of because we don't know how to take care of them at home, and a lot of times people just didn't want to say that they had a child who was special, right? And Arbus was like, no way, that is not okay. So she built a relationship with this one facility and spent enough time there that she got to know the people who live there. They're not patients, they were people who lived there, and was able to take really, really beautiful photographs of them. And this was shocking because she wouldn't talk about that, much less take photos of it, and then like show the photos in public in a museum. It was crazy. It probably doesn't seem as crazy now, but it was huge. You have like people like other big photographers who are like, these are beautiful pictures of, trees and mountains. Like, these are beautiful pictures of beautiful people. And she's like, no, these are not, these are people too, and they should be recognized. So it is because of people like Arbus and many, many others that queerness is something that we are starting to talk about more. The private body in all its variations and identities is now widely recognized, acknowledged publicly, and we continue to see more and more trans people, for example, being elected to public office. So that is not to say we do not have so much work to do in this area, right? So much work, but it is a step in the right direction. And so this is cool. I found this, right? This is a list. This is from 2017? I think 2017. Of all of trans people who've been elected to office. So like the first openly transgender woman of color elected to public office. Let's see, Virginia's first transgender public official. Anyway, so these are all these people, and it's like amazing. Like, could that? I mean, when I was sitting in your seat, that could have never happened, right? 20 years ago. So it's exciting to see that, but it has been because of work of Arbus and all these other people who slowly but surely, in Arendtian language, like guaranteed liberty, right? And that they are seen as people. They are seen as people, like they're the same as normative people, and that they should be treated as such. And then, because that was ensured, then they could be political actors. And so there's the anniversary of Stonewall, right, which is this moment when the people who were at the club said, no, we will just not handle this anymore. So that's a seminal moment. That's why it, like, I guess last year was the anniversary. There was a lot of publication and performances around it. Okay. Now that we have completed a very high level discussion of Arendt and pointed out some criticisms, I want to talk about why I think Arendt is important and why I have chosen to study her for such a long time. Arendt has uncannily been able to anticipate some of the biggest challenges in politics. For example, in Origins, that very thick book, she worried about the development of mass movements and how leaders capitalize on people who are alienated from their communities. In The Human Condition, she worried about how the dissolution of the line between private and public could confuse the way we make decisions. In Eichmann and in Revolution, she warned us that sympathy has a very tricky relationship with public action. In The Life of the Mind, which continues to be my favorite, she turns back to her theological studies and considers how we balance thought, body, and spiritedness, for lack of a better term. And she beautifully examines the intricate relationship between contemplation, alienation, and thinking. Her work continues to be fleshed out and made relevant by other thinkers like Judith Butler, but also Adriana Cavalero, who's an Italian feminist. Her work, Horrorism, which is a really, if you want to read about horror, political horror, it's a great book. It's very short, and she writes in a very accessible manner. So Horrorism expands upon and contextualizes much of the work that Arendt puts forward in Origins. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that her work continues to be more and more important, and not that because she's perfect, or that her writing, definitely, or her writing is always that accurate. In fact, it's been shown that some of the scholarship that Arendt wrote that was included in Origins, particularly on Stalin, was inaccurate. I think she's important because she demonstrates that thinking must be linked with acting, that we must have the courage to show who we are and what we believe in front of and also in spite of others. In that act, we must be willing to consider the ideas of others and reframe our own thoughts. If nothing else, Arendt provides a model of how an intellectual can literally change the world. That is the end of that portion. I now want to ask you guys, first of all, do you have questions on that? But I want to get to the talking part where we all talk together. Do you have questions on any of the content? I mean, you can reread it. Let's talk. Okay, so I want to, like, we have all these categories, these great Arendtian categories. So we have public, private, social, labor, work, and action. And so, like, let's pretend that we are Arendt, and let's answer some questions that we might be asking, that we are asking while getting prepared to vote in 2020. So, how do you think Arendt would vote on certain things, or how do you think this coincides or like intertwines with Arendt's thought? Because in this essay that I gave you, a lot of these things are talked about in maybe off like small ways, but I want to put this to you guys. Yeah? All right. Do citizens have the right to publicly provided health care? Is that part of the guarantee of liberty? That's your first question. Another question we could talk about is, same vein of liberty, should college tuition be free for students, according to Arendt? Also, should issues like abortion, which Arendt would consider an act of labor, be part of the public sphere when she definitely aligns it with the private sphere? And one of my favorite ones, should a politician's private life be shared in public? So the rise of the social, right? Should that social aspect of a person be a deciding factor in our assessment of their ability to govern, according to her? Yes. Let's talk about this from Arendt's point of view, and then we can talk about what we need to. But okay, so healthcare, college tuition, these are all issues, right, that we're going to be talking about for the election, right? Healthcare, college tuition, abortion, and a politician's private life, which is like, yes.
I had a comment on the private life.
Yes.
And sharing public.
Yeah.
So, from Arendt's perspective, love and the bright light cannot survive the public, so it can't survive. You know, we're all gonna have opinions, and we're all gonna be all over that. Maybe that's gonna sway our decision about their, whatever their platform is. So I say it shouldn't be in, their private life should not be in public. Yeah, we like to know, we're curious. First question I wrote down for you was, did you read any of the letters? And you went in to say you read the letters, that you felt kind of, you know, the love letter. So we naturally wanna know.
Right, because it connects us with others, right? It
Yes,
connects us.
it connects us, yes. So, do we have that right to be connected to someone because that private stuff in there, I really think I could do without that.
So, in that, how much do you think, just to make a guess, how much do you think of our political dialogue surrounding the election has to do with people's private lives, their personality, their, you know, all of these types of things? What Arendt would consider private, right? So this is where you get into that tricky notion of how you make decisions, whether they're rational decisions or compassionate decisions, or you're making a moral judgment on someone. So what do you, like, do we get to do that? Do we get to do that? Because if we don't think about a person's private life, right, that dramatically changes an assessment of Donald Trump, does it not?
Yes.
Absolutely. So should we not be, and I don't have an answer to this, should we just stop talking about all of that and just talk about what he's done in the context of the 2020 election? Can we do that? It's so fun to talk trash about people, right? Is it important for us to look at the personal life? Does it indicate the type of person that they would be when they're in office?
Yes, because it shows you the moral character. It's the character, yeah.
So do we not?
Motivation behind.
So here's the problem.
Actions.
Who is perfect?
No one.
No one is perfect. So if you are a reasonable person who has made mistakes, I've made a ton of mistakes, some of them for fun, some of them not, but like, I would never run for office. I have done so many fun things that someone's gonna find out, right? So
Yeah,
it makes people with frailties and, you know, thoughts and have the courage to make mistakes, makes us not want to run for office. So that, so I always think about that, but I'm talking too much, yes.
Well, if we go back to the Trump example, even if we took out his private life, his public life of his previous jobs with the previous bankruptcies would be enough, I think, to get, you know, to even counteract what we see in his private life.
Right, that's a good point.
So for Trump, he has a very public life outside of his private life that's already very negative.
And he's publicized his private life, so he's chosen to do that, yes.
I think that politicians and other people that are in the public eye having to bury, you know, pieces of their humanity, if you will, like mistakes, like you said earlier, even like family history and things like that they have no control over, so deep down, leads to a part of, you know, how I think ineffective a lot of people in office are, because they're so good at burying those things down deep that they become like essentially a little bit, many, not all, become a little bit conniving sort of, and hiding their secrets, and once they do come out, they're like these giant snowballs that just destroy their careers, whereas like, we would just leave certain things, like sure, like some things you need to know about, like, you know, affairs and things like that, like, none of your business, you know?
Right.
And it just destroys their careers as well.
So yeah.
For women though, only for women.
Well, maybe if
For
we
men
made it
too.
more open, then some of these things will become less taboo. So what if you smoked a bunch of pot when you were like
Or
25?
that your spouse has a mental,
or something like that.
mental illness, right?
That's your private life. If
Everybody
it doesn't
has a
affect
problem.
what you do at work, why does it matter?
Yep, definitely.
I think that Hannah would be very concerned about homogenizing our society. And I think that's what you were alluding to about, oh, well, we have to hide these things. We can only be a certain way. I think that would frighten her. Maybe piss her off first and then frighten
We
her.
definitely think
Yeah,
for sure.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
That she was like on that cusp of the edge, so like trying to put everything in neat little boxes would have been like horrifying.
I totally agree with hiding a part of humanity.
So it's almost like, so I was always told, and you still hear this thing, excuse me, basically that like, you know, if you make a mistake, it's like, oh, well, you can't be president, you know?
Yeah.
It's almost, you know, but I feel that because Donald Trump was elected to presidency with all of the laundry list of faults and flaws and, you know, social, you know, people would socially disagree with greatly. He's president, it's almost allowed other people to run for office even with a criminal background. And, you know, they explain away, it's like, yeah, you know, this happened, but now my life has changed. And, you know, and
It's
they
the
spin
Christian
it.
ethic, right? It's
Yeah.
that we can all be born again if we.
Yeah, but
Unless
unless
you're
you
a
make
woman.
the
Yeah.
right
Unless
mistakes,
you're a woman.
yeah.
Yeah,
Because there's
women,
no such thing
it's
as
not
the
very
mistakes
forgiving.
that you can look over
Sure.
your shoulder, like there was some salt over your shoulder, you know, we
Yeah.
don't talk about it anymore. And there's the mistakes that kind of haunt you for life.
What are those mistakes?
Like if you're a woman and you've had an abortion, I doubt that person would run for politics because they're gonna pull that up out of her past and hold that over her head so hard.
It's like 1 in 3 women have,
One in-
at least 1 in 3
yeah.
women have had an abortion. Yep.
So that's not the right mistake, that's not something that people are gonna look at and be like, oh, you know what? You know, she was young, or woo woo woo, or this happened.
It's fine that she's a baby killer.
Yeah, no one's gonna say that. It
Right.
shouldn't matter, but no one's gonna look past.
I think it's highly relevant to this conversation, especially in regards to women and the way that they're not forgiven the same way that men are, especially in the public realm, is that Congresswoman, I cannot recall her name right now,
Oh, yeah.
that just recently had to step down because her ex-husband like revenged her and like, you know, posted a bunch of nude photos of her and like other things, like no one's business, and she
Yeah,
she like had to step down because of like death threats and like other wild things.
Meanwhile, our president has paid off mistresses to keep them out.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's use the terms, right? So what is that relationship that you're talking about between like what should be kept private and what should be public? And then how do you situate that within like the social? Because I think what you're all saying is that to a certain degree, the social, what you would consider the social, is an indicator of who the person is and how they would act on your behalf, right? So in a way, are we saying that Arendt should not be as afraid of the social as she is?
No, because the social can break down.
Yes.
I feel like she has a right to be afraid of the social, like you said. Once you bring your private life into the public sphere, then it becomes unethical. So we see in politics, we see people bringing their people putting their private lives into the public sphere, and then people using those things against them, or like you see commercials. Well, this person did this or this person did this. It's like a tactic to discredit their credibility,
It's an
discredit them.
ad-hominem, right?
So it's really unethical in the political sense because we're supposed to be focusing on their capabilities and what they can do for us as citizens, but instead we're focusing on other things like if they had an abortion or if they had an affair, which is really, has nothing to do with what they can do for us.
So yeah, yes.
If I'm understanding it correctly, I feel that it's almost like people can use your very, 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 very personal life as ammunition for character assassination.
But again, there are some mistakes that we can just sort of look over, and then some mistakes that are, you know,
Like you're a
Yeah,
murderer
who
or
gets to
something.
choose? Who gets to choose?
You know,
You know, I think of, Sonia Sotomayor's book, Like the Love Story you were reading, and how she chose to tell things of her life with the goal of helping someone else. And I love that because, it is separate than, you know, what her, political views and stances are, in a sense. I mean, I guess we all probably know somewhat about her political views, but, I love that way of doing it, because if we would have not known much other about Donald Trump than whatever those shows were he used to do, and whatever he put out there for the public, you know, other than just digging for dirt, I think his foreign policy and other things would have stood on their own for failure, without all this private stuff. And, you know, what would we think of Hannah if she would have just thrown all her private stuff out there and, you know, everybody was digging in her private stuff? I like that it's private.
Yeah, but I just did, right, I just gave you like 5 minutes on her private life,
right.
because I thought it was important to demonstrate like what her public life was, right?
It
So,
didn't affect anything.
but I'm sharing her private, like, I'm sharing parts of like, she talks about like love,
Right.
right? Those So it's, I mean, I feel weird about the social, right? I do, yes.
Well, she said like the things that she told us didn't affect how we view Hannah Arendt, but would it have made a difference had you got up there and said she killed 3 people? Or that, you know, she had, all her relationships past Heidegger were all affairs. She didn't believe in the, you know, was it the word I'm looking for?
Institution.
Monogamy, yeah.
Oh, she has her hand up.
Yeah, she had her hand up
Oh,
first.
okay,
and then
yeah, I
her-
totally not paid, yes, sorry.
Okay, so going back, maybe sorta, I was just gonna bring up that something I've learned since being in political science is that a lot of questions can be answered with it depends. And you have situations like, you know, Martin Luther King was a great man, you know, he helped the civil rights movement greatly, but in his private life, he cheated on Coretta, a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And he cheated on her with white women at the same time while he was like, you know, trying to liberate people.
Yep.
But then you have people like heads of police departments who have backgrounds in the KKK. That's something that you need to know as a public knowledge for, you know, your safety. But something like, you know, I don't agree with it, but Martin Luther King cheating on his wife, you know, I'm not his best friend. I wouldn't be his best friend for that, but you know, his actions in civil rights is something that, you know, we can all commend on and say that's great. You know, even Gandhi had his issues, like he wasn't the most racially tolerant of people, but you know, he still he helped liberate India from the British. And so it's a lot of, you know, if then. So I think it really does depend on what is the situation, like what they are doing, what are their actions, because you can have someone like Donald Trump who, outside of his private life, his actions and what he said and what he supported, you know, it kind of corresponds with it. Like you can see from his past, like, oh, he's not a great man, and that reflects in his actions. But then you have people who keep it hidden, like, you know, KKK members in the police department. They'll use their position and power to, you know, keep the prison system like going, and at the same time, they present this united front, like we're here to protect and serve, but only a limited certain amount of people we're going to protect and serve. So.
I wanna bring up again the idea of redemption and forgiveness, because Christianity is the base of this country, right? We were founded by Puritans. So like, how does, shouldn't we, people make mistakes, even if they're big mistakes, like the KKK, can't someone be redeemed? Can't someone come back from that? Can't we say, yes, you did that, but you have done this and this and this? So that's Brett Kavanaugh, right? So even if Brett Kavanaugh, right, even if Brett Kavanaugh did what he did, if he did, right, which we'll never know, truly we'll never know. But he's like, yeah, but even if that's true, I have done this, I have done this, I have done this, I have done this, right? So if we're in a culture of redemption and forgiveness, why was that enough? Yes, in the very back, because, okay. Are you just holding your hand up for others?
No, I have something to say, but she was before me.
Oh, okay,
so-
okay.
I think to speak to Arden's fear of like bringing that private part of your life, or just the privateness of your life that everybody has a right to, into the public sphere is valid in the sense that while we should be able to differentiate between personal mistakes and people's capability to do their jobs, our society has never been built on that type of redemption. What we call the lack of redemption for older times is like cancel culture now. We do not, our society has never been built on redemption. It's never been built on allowing people the grace to mess up and redeem themselves. So like, we can't, it's hard to say that personal lives don't matter, because one, I do think people's personal lives do matter to a certain extent when you're trying to decide. People be in charge of things like being the president of the United States, being head of the police department, whatever that is. Those things are important, like she mentioned. If you're a part of the KKK, but you're also part of the police force, and we have such a high rate of incarceration of people of color and police brutality against people of color, those two things are connected. So to say that we should be able to live in a society where your personal life and personal things should come like second or never at all, how can we make that differentiation if we literally have never had a society that has allowed that to happen for anyone? Basically that, we don't have a society of redemption. We have what we call now cancel culture, and that's gone back since the beginning of time.
Yeah, in the back. Yes. Yeah, please.
I think I agree. I think that it matters, like, I don't think that you can separate the two, like, your personal life and, I guess it really depends on the position that you're being put in place for. Like, for example, we've seen like Donald Trump consistently say racist things, always against like black people. Like, it's been consistent over time. The things that he does in his personal life and the things that he does in the public eye has led us to who he is now as a person, and I think that's not something that can be separated. Like, we've watched him be this person over time, and I don't know, for some reason why we thought like, okay, if we put him in the White House it was gonna be any better. It hasn't been any better. He's still that person.
So here's my question for you. I think we're all, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're all saying that a person's private life sometimes affects their ability to do things in the public, and that sometimes private mistakes are more important than others. Yeah? Is that what we're saying? Okay. So with that thought, as people who will be involved in political discourse and lively discussions and debates about the presidential election, how are you going to control, structure, reframe conversations where you are focused more on issues and less on the private, unless the private has a very specific connection to what you're talking about? How do we do that now? How are you going to do that? Yes.
Leave your feelings at home.
Oh.
Yeah, that's basically, like, it doesn't, like, if you have feelings for something that isn't relevant to what that person is doing, like, yeah, just leave your feelings at home. Unless it's something that's really, like, you can't look past, then.
Are you saying don't share your opinion and your feeling about something if someone says something to you?
Not saying
What
my
kind of-
opinion, not saying your opinion, you can't share your opinion about something. I feel like if it's something that isn't really, like, a problematic, like as she's saying, the KKK, it is a problematic, something that's problematic. But if it's something as they have an abortion, or if it's something as they have, I don't know.
So if it
I feel
affects
like
other
what
people, share, but if it doesn't, if it only affects that one person, it's like,
Yeah,
well, that's
yeah,
your
but-
business, stay in your own lane kind of thing?
Yeah.
Okay, I think, yep.
I think the best way to go about it is that you have to look at the position the person is in. You have to look at the kind of power they have. Like, if they're a prosecutor, if they're a judge, you have to look at the influence they have. And when it comes down to it, I mean, things like abortion, things like race, things like that, we do have to take it into account to the extent of the position that they're in. If they're just a prosecutor and they did, you know, at some point in time in their life, they decided to make that decision, in that kind of position, it doesn't necessarily matter. But however, if they are a judge, a Supreme Court judge, it does kind of matter. So I think that's what it comes down to. Like, even one of our presidential candidates, I can't think of her name, but no, it's not Warren, but it's the other one. Yes, she was a prosecutor. And one of the things they had talked about is that they've been talking about in the article how she may have ruled in favor of the police. Now that is relevant to me, because you're gonna be a president and you have the ability to give electoral orders, and on top of that, you also are in the Congress, which means you've built relationships with people in Congress as well. So to take all that into account, I have to wonder, like, what are you going to do to counteract police brutality? Because right now, when it comes down to it, when it comes to something statutory that's in place, it's on a state level right now. It's not federally. And so the federal needs to be in place. So that does matter. However, if she was strictly a prosecutor, again, it would still matter. But if she was strictly a councilman, then that's what it really comes down to. So all of it, what I'm guessing inclined to say is, to the extent, what I'm trying to say is, the point is, the issue and how strong the issue is as far as their personal life, it matters to the extent of the amount of power they have in the position that they're in.
Yeah, so I'll say it a different way, which is we should have different levels or standards for people based on the position that they have in our government and how, to what degree they reflect are supposed to represent the people at large, right? So can we say then, and I'm just gonna use Brett Kavanaugh, can we say then that we might expect someone of a different type of person? Because I don't want to do character assassination of Kavanaugh either, although I think that he gave himself plenty of room for that in the hearings. It's disgraceful. But anyway, so should we have a standard, a different standard for people based on their position, and how do we determine what that standard is?
I just kind of want to spitball
Yep.
off of her.
Yeah.
Like when she said like, Corporal Charm voted in favor of the police, I feel like in instances like that, we kind of have to look at the patterns or the habits, like how often, because what a person does repeatedly is gonna show you who they are. Because it's something that they built up within themselves, like, people know like about me, like I recently just started running, people know where they're gonna find me if they can't catch me on the phone, like, okay, where's she mobilized to be in the gym, just like that. You're looking at things that people are constantly doing in their positions, it'll give you an instance of like what they're gonna do in the future in similar situations.
Yeah, I agree, but what you're talking about here is like a level of intention and analysis and research that I don't think many people are going to do, right? To say, you voted, I agree with you completely.
Well, it just takes a little bit of like
I agree,
intention.
I agree, but, so if we're thinking about like public space, we're thinking about public dialogue, right? The easiest thing to do is to say someone is a child molester, or whatever, whether it's true or not, right? Because it'll get retweeted and retweeted. So like, what I feel like we're saying here is that if we took more time to research people and determine what their patterns are, their patterns of behavior, then it would help us decide whether their private mistakes should be weighed more heavily, or weighed the way that it should be weighed when we're making a decision. Are we saying that, maybe? Yes.
I feel like the question you asked before, of like, how do we, what was that original question? How do we
Manage like public conversation by having it stay on topic instead of people's private lives?
I feel like that question hasn't been answered. While I think everyone's points are awesome and like completely valid, I wanna go back to what she was saying, because I feel like she didn't get to articulate that properly. We have to, in order for us to facilitate these conversations, we have to learn to not be so overly passionate to the point that we cannot hear the point of the matter, because I feel like it started to get heated because it was like, well, you know, we're not being able to express ourselves. No, we can express ourselves. You can express your opinions, you can say whatever you need to say, and there's nothing wrong with having passion when you're talking about something that means something to you. I think regardless of what side of the fence you're on, your political party, your beliefs, left, right, left, up, down, whatever, you're gonna have feelings behind it, but sometimes our feelings are so strong that we end up derailing the point of the conversation and the facts of the conversation, and we never get to have the upfront conversation that needs to be had because we're so in our feelings.
Yeah,
And that's what she means by leave your feelings at the door.
Yeah.
Like, we have facts, we have logic, we're trying to get to a point, like when we're having these debates, like presidential debates, this isn't a mud ball throwing, competition. We're supposed to be here debating and bringing our facts forward. And we don't get to do that because everything becomes so overly passionate and like hyped up. So I think in order to do that, one, we need to make sure that, like, for example, when those debates are happening, I wish the moderators would do more to like keep the conversation on track. Like, okay, hey, we're not talking about, your sketchy emails. We're talking about the question that was asked here, what are you gonna do about universal health care? We don't care that this person said something not so nice to you on the internet. We wanna know the answer about what are you gonna do about prison reform, and these are the facts. So I feel like in order for us to have that conversation, whatever it's regarding to, we have to understand about leaving our feelings at the door and bringing facts. Because at the end of the day, that's what can be undisputed. That's what the truth is, not your personal passionate feelings that you have about this.
If we know that social media, right? I mean, you could tweet something and it could be retweeted by like 1 million people, right? It's possible. I don't know if you have a good Twitter following. I do not have that kind of Twitter following. But we know that individual people and their voice can be heard in a way, like much different way than it ever has been, right? So like as individual political advocates and protesters and commenters, how are you going to keep the conversation in line, for lack of a better term, right? How are you gonna make sure that people aren't overly passionate and that people are listening to facts and that people aren't sort of taking things too personally? Because ultimately, we know that so much of conversation around politics is in social media, which, I mean, I post stuff on fact checking all the time. no one gives a shit about my fact checking, like Facebook posts. I do, but very few people do. So like,
Continuously hit them with the facts.
yeah, so, okay, so that's how, but how do you do that if our play here is bipartisanship, including people, right? How many times can you say something, say like, no, your dude is a liar, and it doesn't, right? Right? But so that's what I'm saying is that to the degree that, like, we all have much more power to control political conversations than I think we realize, right? So like my thing right now, because I have people, I have Marxists and socialists and Trump supporters, I have like every single type of person in my Facebook feed because it keeps me honest, right? And but like right now I'm so frustrated because I'm trying to find the perfect quote, which is just be kind, right? That's my thing right now. Like I just want everyone to just, like you're saying, like take it down and just be a little kind. So I don't want to say, no, you're wrong. I think you're dumb. That's not even true. We can prove this with this, and we give you 5 citations. That alienates people. We could just start, I think, by asking people to be kind, right? So I see things that are really, really just people are so amped up, and that's what I'm trying to figure out how to do. How do I just take the level down a little bit and have people think about, like, I'll give you an example. So I have a friend who did something about Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, who's surprised, and saying that she was a witch or something. I don't know. It was whatever. It was what it was. And I put in there, I was like, listen, I think that in this specific example that you're giving me, like, I think that all people kind of acted in an ugly way, right? Like, so admit, yeah, should Nancy Pelosi have torn up that speech as a leader? Should she have done that? I don't know. Maybe it was an act of political protest. It was definitely something, right? And so we are like, yay, Nancy Pelosi showed him, right? And she ripped up the thing. But if there was a Democrat in office and a Republican did that, like, what would our attitude be about that? Oh, it's terrible that they did that. So I think I'm kind of off topic, but the point is that we should be, in my mind, or what I'm trying to do, because the call for improving political discourse is just as much mine as it is yours, right? So the only way I can see to approach that is to first ask people to just be a little kinder. And I don't necessarily think that Arendt would like that at all. She's like, you should just give facts, and that is just how it is. But I don't agree with Arendt in this case. I just don't. She very rarely showed emotion at all.
Right.
She didn't care about anyone's feelings. But that's all I have been able to come up with. Yes.
I think, like, I get that you're trying to say, like, you think the conversation could be started by everybody being kind and not just being like, oh, just bring your facts and then just leave everything away.
Yeah.
But I think that goes back to, like, her point in the front, like, everything about humans is about behavior, it's about feelings, it's about your emotions, like, every single thing about humans is like that. So saying, like, you know, everybody should just try to be kind, I don't think we're ever gonna get to that point until we start actually looking at people's behavior and how people are going to change over time and react to things. Like, we can say it all day and we can, you know, try to do it all day, but at the end of the day, like, where we're at, the media is very important to how we see things, and how information gets out is through the media, through social media, and we can't have face-to-face conversations with people anymore because it's just technology has taken over everything, and we can't, in person, it'd be better to say, okay, you know what, I can see your facial reaction, I can see that this is making you a certain kind of way, so, you know, I'm gonna tone myself down, and then maybe that'll give you kind of the reaction to tone everything down, and we can have this good conversation, but we don't have that anymore.
Well, we choose not to.
We don't have conversations.
In relation to what she said, but more so about the reading on revolution, you know, both revolutions were great, like France and for America, like we are where we are now because of that revolution. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think beheading the rich was a kind move, or some people would not view it as that. But going back to like the social media, even back then they didn't have those face-to-face conversations because you had the elite not paying attention to those who were hidden, and then in America we were divided by a whole ocean, so we weren't speaking face-to-face with the king.
Right.
And so, you know, I think sometimes but the outcome doesn't always turn out that way. And so it's great to look at it from both sides, but at the same time, you kind of have to have a handle on the situation, like your emotions going into it, because in the paper, it was talking about, the impoverished mothers in France, like walking with their children, like their children had died from starvation, disease, and all of that. And that's something emotionally evoking. But in terms of America, it was emotional because they were fighting for their freedom, but nothing, I mean, I guess you could bring that one where they were shot in the streets, but I mean, up until that point, nothing really truly emotional had happened to them. Like, they weren't starving, they weren't, seeing their mothers and, children dying in the streets and all of that. So, the rich weren't being in your face, like, let's eat cake and all of that, so.
So that's why she talks about the importance of political motivation being the desire for freedom, not the quelling of sympathy or compassion, right? And she says that that's the reason why the French Revolution, which is what you're saying, that's why the French Revolution wasn't successful. But I want to talk about something else that you said.
We've got 4 minutes.
4 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is great, because this is like one thing we didn't talk about with Arendt, and so that's all I'll say, is that Arendt's notion of political freedom is very much about the fact that you go into public space, you say what you think, you do what you think, you have the courage to do that, but at the end of the day, you will never know what happens next. Like, there is an unpredictability that you just can't fathom. You just have to go for it. And so that's why I like to talk about the phenomenology of plurality, because she believed that it is by engaging with a diverse group of people in public space, having the courage to talk about what you thought and the courage to do what you think is important, that you do that, and then you also respect other people doing that. You consider what they're doing, and then you reconsider yourself, right? So what have I learned by talking to these other people, and what have I learned from, if I made a mistake in the action that I took, whatever. So what have I learned, and then you take it back to your own thoughts and say, okay, how has this experience, or the things that I've experienced with others, how has that changed, if it has changed? And for Arendt, you have to be open to that kind of flexibility, because she believes that that's how knowledge is created, right? Is through this thinking between yourself and then thinking and acting with others. It's like this, it's a dialectic of sorts. Okay, does anyone else have anything they want to add?
You were awesome.
I was going to say, please join me in thanking, but you already did that. So let me just say thank you, Joy, for coming home.
Information about the conference, Revolution Conference, htx.com. Houston Proud, where I'm from. Revolution Conference, HTX, go to Socio, S-O-C-I-O, and sign up for the app so you can be part of that conversation. It says Houston Community